Welcome to our roundtable on social science research and policy. Today we want to explore the relationship between social science research and public policy. We want to try to understand factors that influence the questions social scientists ask, the theories they come up with, and how those theories get translated into public policy. In addition, we want to learn how we, as students and the public, can become better consumers in the public policy marketplace. With us today, we have Ken Jameson, Professor of Economics at the University of Utah, Patrick Shea, citizen of Utah and attorney, Doug McDonald, Chief Economist for the Utah State Tax Commission, and Thane Robeson, Professor of Management, University of Utah. I'd like to welcome you all today to the roundtable. The first thing I'd like to know is what determines the questions we ask as social scientists? For example, why would social scientists ask a question regarding the relationship between IQ and race? And can we start with you, Ken?
Sure. I think that's a good starting point. I think one of the things to remember is that the big questions oftentimes really are questions that have been asked before. The question of IQ and race is a good example of that. And in that case, what happened was really a change in scientific knowledge, the theory of evolution that began to raise that. And then, in some sense, influence social scientists to begin to look at that, to develop IQ tests, for example, to deal with it. And what happened in that case was that by the 1920s or 1930s, at least social science had basically concluded that there was no particular link in that fashion. But again, it's become an issue today. And I think a lot of the reason for that is very similar to what happened in the 1890s, that there have been a lot of new developments in genetics, and that then plays over into social science, and the social scientists begin to think about what the implications are, and begin to deal with that, and begin to try and use their own knowledge to answer those kinds of questions. And then it begins to get picked up by the public and public policy, and so it becomes a very, very relevant issue and a very controversial issue at this point. So at one point, historically, you think it's solved and it comes back. And I think if you look at the big issues of free trade, of the budget deficit, you find again these historical times in which they come up, in which social scientists then get engaged in the whole debate. And I think keeping that in mind for a student or for a citizen is very important, that we really can learn a lot about them by looking at what happened in the historical debates.
On the history side, it's interesting, Binet, who was one of the first developers of the IQ test, really developed it to be an educational tool so that he could better suit the needs of the student to educate them. And 100 years later, we're faced with what I would consider to be some racist propagandists using bad data to further their political point of view rather than any educational purpose or a good public policy purpose.
The real issue, in my view, is whether we do know what IQ is and whether we can measure race, or whether we're measuring cultural and lots of socioeconomic variables that we mask as either IQ or race. And people will return to this issue for a variety of reasons, whatever their agenda. The current research, it seems to me, points out as much as anything that we really not sure we know what IQ is and what we're measuring, and we certainly don't know what we're measuring when we try to deal with the questions of race and look at them separate from socioeconomic characteristics, culture, and lots of other variables. So in my view, it's a classic example of what social scientists ought not to be doing, because they really can't specify in scientific terms what it is they're about.
Well, what about this, though, Patrick? You brought up that ideology plays a part. How important is that in terms of the questions we ask?
Well, I think a lot of times that's the difference between truly a good social scientist and what I would characterize as a bad social scientist. A good social scientist recognizes what Thane was saying, and that is there are some limited areas, tax policy like Doug has to formulate. You can make fairly precise macroeconomic predictions based on past performance and certain analysis of variables, and that's a very important social tool for economic planning reasons. But I think when you move over, as Murray and Herstein have in the bell curve, into making bold statements that cannot be proven or disproven, and yet assert them as if they are so socially, scientifically valid is a disservice to the discourse that goes on. So ideology in that instance is driving their statement, not good social science.
Can I go back to something?
Wait,
Oh, go ahead.
I think another factor here is technology. Technology enables social scientists to more easily calculate, using correlation coefficients and ANOVA and those kinds of methods, using all this data, calculate and come up with correlations. And the correlations may be spurious, but there's still there's a significance about them there. And so then they project on, make a conclusion from maybe some spurious correlations they get. But the technology makes more data available, and so that's going to bring back these questions that have been
So correlation and
over
causality
time.
could lead to wrong conclusions if you assume correlation implies causality. For example, the classic example of in Germany, I think in the 1700s, storks and babies are correlated. So we don't want to make policy based on causation.
In my statistics class, it was the wind velocity and the birth rate in Cuyahoga County.
Ah, okay.
All sorts of
a high
Let me
correlation
go back to
doesn't
something
do
that,
anything.
that Thane said before Cuyahoga County, though. He said that this is a kind of issue that social scientists shouldn't be involved in. And I guess I would disagree with that. I think we are involved in it, I think mainly psychologists, right, who have developed the IQ tests, et cetera. And it seems to me that we have to become involved in it because it is one of the recurrent issues. And it turns out that I think most good social scientists, if you would, really think that the issue has been resolved. But yet, if social scientists wash their hands of that and say, oh, well, we resolved it back in the 1920s, then I think it does get picked up by the ideologues, by the racists, et cetera. So I really think there's a responsibility of social scientists to become involved.
I think there's...
Just one additional thing. In one of the American Psychological Association, for example, has just come out with a statement on on what we know about intelligence, which I think is very helpful in terms of summarizing it and trying to clear up some of the misconceptions and misuses of that data. And I think that I'm an economist, so that's clearly not something that I'm going to get involved in, but I think that's very relevant and appropriate for social scientists to do. Excuse me.
I think one of the biggest problems, as a lawyer, I often can tell a client what not to do based on my experience and on my education. And I think one of the things that Ken was addressing is the importance of having social scientists stand up and say, this is either bad social science or it's trying to use social science outside the field that is really well suited for. And in that regard, one of the problems we've got in our modern time is we have a huge amount of information that Doug was talking about, and we have incredible ways of analyzing it, but we don't, in my judgment, have a consistent way of discerning whether or not the truth is really there. And one of the dilemmas for our time, in my judgment, is to how best to deal with propaganda. That is, information that is generated to be independent of the truth and to further a particular ideology or political point of view. To me, that is the peril of our time, and that's where I hope people, as they train in social science, understand their, if you will, moral obligation to make sure that bad social science is called that and that the general public is aware that they shouldn't rely on it.
Well, this gets to this question, though. How is the general public supposed to know what's good social science and what's bad social science? And I want to phrase this in an issue that, suppose we all ask the same question, such as what is the appropriate role of government, what is the optimal tax rate, what is the relationship between welfare and family formation. We all have the same questions. Why are there so many different answers?
Well, I think part of it's the media. I mean, the media has this perspective that if you're going to say something, you always have to have an opposing point of view. So that on the question of race, you could have someone stand up and say, that is bad social science, and the media would then feel obligated to have somebody who would say, well, no, it's good social science. So the general populace is sitting out there kind of going, who's right? And in many instances, if there are sophisticated correlations or other statistical formulas used, it's a hard thing to discern. But I think that's one of the things that I go back to on the information question.
But I think your question raises in my mind this issue about the difference between social science research and other kinds of disciplines. Social scientists are great at analyzing alternative means to an end and to looking at the impact of various kinds of policies, or at least partially the impact. It is not within the purview of science or social science to determine what the ultimate ends ought to be. That's a problem for theology, for philosophy, for ethics, these are not questions that research makes a particular contribution to. The pursuit of truth has been a noble pursuit for the human family, but we ought to at least recognize what it is, social science research in particular, but what science in general can do with those issues. Now, the issue is made even more complex because what becomes an end for one person or organization becomes a means for another. And so it is a complex issue. But what I hope we believe in is that social science research can, in fact, improve and help us to understand the role of government, the role of public policy, the impact of a tax or an expenditure and investment in education, and we can evaluate that using our tools and at least provide the best information available to the public so that they can make informed decisions based on the facts, based on the best analysis. But we also have to recognize there are tremendous limits. There is an old joke among economists that economics is the only profession where two people can get a Nobel Prize for saying diametrically opposed things, and did in the year in which the Nobel Prize was offered to Hayek and to Myrdal. So that there are differences and different schools of thought and different theories, but that does not preclude us, I think, from bringing our tools, our knowledge to bear to try to amass and present facts for the analysis of public policy. And that we've got some noble examples of that in the history of the United States. One of my old professors Alfred Kahn led the deregulation movement in this country. It has been not a nice, neat change in public policy, but on balance, the deregulation movement and the research which it triggered in terms of government regulation of the market process has had a pretty fundamental change on a great many American industries over the past 2 decades. That's one area where social science research has made, I believe, a remarkable contribution to the goals of our society.
But I think what the citizen needs to do, and Pat Shea said he was a citizen, but apparently only 17%. Now he tells us he's a lawyer. So 17% of the people take newspapers. That's all. And I think, and if people just confine themselves to only one portion of the media, such as late night commentators, their views are going to be very stilted and narrow. So I think the citizen needs to look at all the different sources, newspapers, weekly newspapers, magazines, and in that way he can become informed. And I think most of us here who believe in democracy believe that citizens will make, basically correct choices.
I always think my grandfather was a railroad engineer. His education stopped when he was in 8th grade. And he was one of the more intelligent people that I've ever been around. And to my mind, he would listen, as many people today don't seem capable of. I think Doug's comment that we become niched into, we listen to our favorite comedian or we listen to our favorite commentator. And the Rush Limbaugh phenomenon is a good example. We listen to what we want to hear, not something that may challenge us. But my grandfather had sort of a triangulation. The first question is it just? Is it fair, and is it truthful? And it seems to me that those are elements or virtues that have been with us for literally millenniums, and we need to use them more often than we seem to do today. And we seem to have this crutch that we're not an expert, and therefore we can't have an opinion. And I would hope that as we move into the 21st century, people who are going through the universities would see that those tools are available to them even if they're not a specialist in economics or a specialist in tax policy, and you can tell the difference. If it smells like a rat, it probably is.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Mary, I think that kind of the crucial standpoint from my perspective is that people be critical of judgment, and particularly if there's an economist or a politician who's making a very simple answer to a complex problem. I think one of the things you learn from social science, from economics, from psychology, is that the important problems really are very complex, and we may be able to cut them up and get bits and pieces that we can resolve. But if it's an important problem, it's going to be very complex. So anyone who comes along and says, okay, if we balance the budget, the problems of the United States, in some sense, at the macro level will be solved. Boy, that there's your rat right there. That's much too simplistic. And so I think people have to learn to be critical and begin to understand what some of the underlying social science analysis is, because I think they can. But I think all too often we look for those simplistic solutions, and we elect people who offer them to us. And I think that until we become more critical, we won't really be able to use what social science can offer. And I think we offer a lot.
I think in Utah especially, we need to learn that we can disagree but not be, at each other's throat. I mean, the civility is something that I think we've in some senses lost, that we're so used to the histrionics of paid professional entertainers, both left and right, on television, that we seem to think that political discussion or discussion about social science has to be that kind of confrontation. And I think the ordinary citizen is frankly put off by it. And if they took on as a role to be civil in their criticalness, I think we would go a lot further than we've gone.
But there are some rules, I think, that students in a beginning economics class ought to understand when they address these kinds of issues. And every time somebody makes a proposal, a student should ask, what is the interest that that person has personally in that proposal? If someone wants to support farm subsidies, for example, the student needs to know more that this might be of some benefit to farmers, but it's going to be paid for and involve a wealth and income transfer from consumers. And it is to understand that public policy is a multifaceted, or a question with frequently more than two sides. If the world was so simple that there were only two sides to every question, it would be easy. And so you can find those policy issues where there is an analysis about what is the impact of this policy on a particular segment of the economy. That's only a part of the issue that ought to be studied. It's not just who pays, but who benefits. Is there an alternative way to accomplish the same objective that will distribute the costs and the benefits differently in the society? And I am a very strong believer that social scientist researchers have a great contribution to make to the public policy dialogue, and that we allow political considerations to interfere with that in transportation policy, in agricultural policy, in healthcare policy, in almost any policy area you want to take. You can ask, what is the contribution that social science research has made? What is the contribution that better social science research could make? But it is ultimately somebody else's responsibility, not the social scientist, to make the final set of decisions. And they may be based on weighing the interests rather than weighing the facts, and they are not the same thing.
Well, this gets me then to a question you asked is about, we come up with theories, and then as social scientists, then we try to find data or information to support these theories. And then that menu goes to the policymakers who can decide what they want, supposedly. So the question I want to ask you is there abuses in social science in terms of using data? And can data show anything you want to show? Does that happen? Anybody want to go for
think
that?
That's a
I think the
showstopper.
answer is clearly yes. People want to use a little bit of bad data to demonstrate a point they predetermined in advance, and that is they use data and facts and theory as a weapon, not in terms of the kind of objective analytical tool that I think everybody on this panel would defend it. And there are demagogues in the world, and they do in fact want to tell you only a part of the story or to distort the story, and we see as much misuse probably of some of the tools of social science research, never by good university professors, you understand, nor by great public citizens and civil servants like are represented at this panel. But we see examples of that every single day.
But if social science works, I mean that's why disciplines like psychology or economics or sociology are important, because what happens if it works the way it often does and should is that a social scientist who basically has gone in and has biases, and most of us do have biases, but has used flawed data, has skewed the data, the publication process within the discipline is where that will get corrected.
So this is similar to if you're a bad doctor and you get enough malpractice suits, eventually you lose your license. So is this what happens in?
Yeah, and you know sometimes it doesn't happen, but I think that's why it's so important for social scientists to get involved in the issues. And then if someone is making those arguments and puts them out, publishes them, then you will find people taking that, critiquing it, trying to find out what's really going on there. So a lot of our knowledge, I think it's important to realize, is really a kind of communal knowledge. We create it together. I mean, it's something the Greeks really understood very well, and that was the basis of their democracy, that they really created a kind of knowledge together and really worried about that. And I think, you know, Pat's point about the kind of way we talk to each other is very relevant there, that they had a way of talking to each other where they could reach some kind of agreement. Well, I think that is social science at its best, and that when we can take those errors that someone is making, can critique them, can correct them, then I think we get closer to being able to understand the issues. I think in many ways that's probably why the American Psychological Association has come out with their statement on intelligence, trying to deal with that.
I think the only point I would disagree with is that you're making implicitly a distinction between good social scientists and bad social science. What I think happens, unfortunately, is if a person is a good social scientist, they can usually find a legitimate line of work in the academy or someplace in the economy to practice good social science. What happens with bad social science is often they get into politics. They use the semblance, and well, I think Senator Graham is a good example, and the Speaker of the House. Both are failed academics who I think are using the tools they were trained with as academics to practice good social science to try now to argue and impose social policy under the guise of some kind of good social science. And that worries me, and it goes right to your question of how does the ordinary citizen distinguish? When some political leader stands up and says, I have a PhD in economics, and these are the facts that will happen if we have a flat tax, or these are the facts that will happen if we have no deficit. And Ken's right, it's so complex that nobody in their right mind can respond, and so the demagogue is able to continue the propaganda, and it continues to go out.
But certainly, Senator Graham might be an example of the process actually working, right? I mean, if he dropped out of the presidential race because his flat tax proposal simply was not very acceptable,
went flat.
Then, yeah, right. Then in one sense, maybe people can see through that, and there's a reason for hope in terms of dealing with those issues.
But I think you can look at some examples right here in our time where social science research has made a significant contribution to public policy. In the recent session of our legislature, and I'll defer to my friend Doug, but there are some legislators who came in saying, Utah voters do not like the property tax. It's the most hated tax, therefore we're going to cut the property tax. Well, there was some information, facts, analysis brought to bear. A, public opinion polls that did not support that particular proposition to begin with. And I love to hear politicians say the voters believe, and as if somehow or another they knew what the voters wanted or didn't want, in the absence of careful examination of that. Secondly, a piece of work done by a research foundation in town that dealt with the consequences of changing property taxes vis-a-vis other taxes in the system. And we watched over the course of a legislative session. Maybe the solution that came out was not the one you preferred or was perfect, but it certainly was impacted by the kind of data, the kind of analysis, the kind of information that was brought to bear, so that we ended up with a proposal that was ultimately enacted by the legislature, which I would argue was impacted in a very significant way by social science research and was a better policy as a result of that than would otherwise be the case. Now, Doug, is that an unfair example? Tell me.
No, that's not an unfair example. I think the original view that they were just going to give a property tax cut became compromised as some of the senators felt that the income tax, it was time for the income tax to be revisited and that be adjusted too. They missed, in our view, they missed a few areas of particularly rebracketing the income tax, which hasn't been done since 1973. And you know, I feel that's very unfortunate that that doesn't rise with inflation, because it means that the middle class and lower middle class get a higher and higher tax burden. But that's our own particular view, and they didn't. One of the problems is, does the legislature ask for opinions from people that work with these things? And many times there's not enough time, or there's not enough inclination to ask. They just think they already have the information at hand.
Don't bother me with the facts.
Don't bother me. They're irrelevant. Facts are irrelevant.
That's right.
But you do think that the analysis of tax structure and the tax implications really did have a role on the final outcome on that?
I think Thane is right. The report from the Utah Foundation had a bearing on the final outcome.
Yeah.
Let me cite another example, water policy in Utah. We go into a session deciding that we're going to put a lot of money into water policy. All of a sudden, people are forced to look at the data, that in Utah we have the highest per capita consumption of water and the lowest price of any place in the country. That's not a defensible policy in a desert. So people start to then become, at least develop some open-mindedness towards data and analysis that suggests that we could raise the price, conserve water, not impact rates of economic growth, and not incur the very large public expenditures that the water lobby would like to have made at taxpayers' expense. And it was a very different issue when we were getting the federal government to pay those expenses. Then that's somebody else who pays and we get the benefit. But now when we have to pay for the benefits that we're going to get, and the benefits are much less than the costs, and the legislature and the citizenry come to understand that, we get better public policy, and that is now happening, in my view, in Utah, and I'm very encouraged by it.
Okay, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for watching the Roundtable.